Dr. Yosef Ben-Jochannan, also known as Dr. Ben, was a prominent historian, Egyptologist, and scholar of African and African American history. He was born in Ethiopia in 1918 and passed away in 2015. Dr. Ben-Jochannan works focused on highlighting the contributions of African civilization to world history and challenging Eurocentric views of history.
This historic person, you see, is an historian who, with his dynamic way of presenting history, has won a large following all over the nation. His specialty in history is Egyptology. His name, Professor Yosef Ben-Jochannan, affectionately known as Dr. Ben.
Hear it commonly said in your church, synagogue, or wherever, that Moses, Moshe, received the 10 Commandments, and thus men got laws. Men had laws long before that, thousands of years. Moses is not until 1346, before the Christian era will give us to about the 18th dynasty. Amenhotep IV, otherwise known as Akhenaten, died before Moses was born.
Dr. Ben has lectured widely across this nation, Africa, the Caribbean, and Europe. He's been a long-standing member of the Cornell University History Department. His central theme has been to emphasize that the renowned Egyptian culture was built by Africans who were black. His many appearances on Like It Is have reaffirmed this.
The ultimate to this was the destruction, trying to destroy the face of the symbol of the god Hamatis, which they call the Sphinx of Giza, which Napoleon ordered his lieutenant to blow away the face. And that's the damage to it. It is even documented by one of his men that was in Count Vivian Dunant, who was there with Volney and others, and write these evidence of what took place. Your 21 gun salutes come from that, the 21 guns it took to shoot the face partially off.
Dr. Ben's activities have not been limited to academia. He's been a loud spokesman for African nationalism long before it became popular. He was among those who attended the Harlem funeral of Malcolm X, despite bomb threats at the time. Recently, Dr. Ben sat with us and recounted some aspects of his life, going way, way back.
I was born in 1918, December 31st, Ethiopia.
New Year's Eve.
New Year's Eve. I guess my mother said I wouldn't wait.
In Ethiopia?
Yes.
What part?
Gondar. Now there's a lot of argument about that, is that being in the Virgin Islands as a small kid and the transfer of the island from the Danish to the American, there were a point in which you had to be proclaimed an American citizen or Danish citizen or not. And papers were transferred. And so for many of us youngsters, we wound up with American papers of the Virgin Islands, and so there were some disarrangements or so, but didn't bother me one way or the other.
How did you get from Ethiopia across the Atlantic?
Well, according to the family, is that my father went to Brazil to work as one of the people in the Consul General office, and the transfer of coffee, the trade between the coffee, and that's how he went down there.
That's what he did for a living? That was his profession, or what?
His profession was barrister, and barrister and quote-unquote gentleman farmer.
Where is he from?
He was born in Ethiopia.
He's in Ethiopia?
Yeah. My mother's a Puerto.
What did your father look like?
My father looked exactly like me.
You looked exactly
the older
like
I get, the more I look like my father.
No, was he home much or what?
Well, my father was between farming and law, and at a short time he taught at a place, the Moravian School, in, I think it's called Friedenstell. There were 3 Moravian churches, one in Christiansted, one in Frederiksted, and one in the countryside, a place called Friedenstell. And he did some student teaching there. That means he taught, so he did a few different things. And on the other hand, my mother and I had nothing in common.
Really?
You couldn't tell that my mother was my mother. By looking at us, there was no way in the world you could tell.
And she was from where?
Born in Puerto Rico, the eastern end, in Fajardo, The family, primarily, the family were in St. Croix, St. Thomas, and Fajardo, the eastern end of Puerto Rico, and a number of them were in the island off there called Vieques. They originally migrated from Yemen, the group, to Spain. They were called Ladinos, and then they wind up in Puerto Rico. And making a study of the background, for instance, my mother's mother was called, her name was Seppi. My mother's father was Cruz, was a Cruz. And so between those two families, then another part of the family in Puerto Rico is called Matas, Dr. Henrico Mata and so forth. I knew much of that part. And there was another part that went to Cuba called Haywood. My mother had a twin sister, and she went to Cuba, and that part of the family became Haywoods.
What religion were you born into?
I was born into the Hebrew religion, and in the Virgin Islands, unfortunately, there was only one synagogue. And it was.
Wait a minute, who was Jewish? Your father?
Both parties.
Your mother's Jewish too?
Yeah. And my father found it necessary at time to dabble in Roman Catholicism. Since in St. Christ there was no Jewish synagogue, there was one in St. Thomas, and seeing a black person who was Jewish was an oddity. And as it's still even up to today, as a matter of fact, most European Jews denied there was such thing as black Jews at that time, and only since the Operation Moses last year did a handful of them admit there is such thing as black Jews. Not one of my teachers taught me anything about Africa, even the best of them.
Did your father teach you much about Africa and tell you much about?
Quite so. In discussion, my father would always, because of his own knowledge and because of being in the UNA, the Garvey movement, anytime I would speak about certain things, as a matter of fact, when Daddy spoke to me about the Torah or the Old Testament, he constantly pointed out to me that which is of Africa in it. For instance, Daddy was saying, well, Moses, he was an African, he was born in Egypt. Long before, when people look at the map, and although they saw Egypt there, didn't recognize Egypt as being in Africa, my father had made that very clear to me. And my father gave me most first books on that, the Book of the Dead, and such books were knowledgeable to me at an early age because of my father.
How did you come to the States and when?
I came to the States in the Second World War.
Why?
Well, the boat was coming to the States.
Okay.
And I had a man who was supposed to be uncle. I said supposed because there's arguments. And especially my family life is kind of argumental as to who I am really in those contexts. And he and another man brought the numbers to America, Casper Hussein, he and Pompey. So I came to and spoke with him.
Where was this? What city?
Here in New York.
All right.
And
Harlem?
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I made my ground here for a while.
What year was that you came to New York?
I came in 1944, I think, 43, 44.
Mm-hmm.
And
right in the middle of things.
Right in the middle of the war. Yeah. And then I made some contacts. I had wanted to go to school here. I've always had a fascination to go to Columbia University, but they weren't taking people with my color in certain professions, certain disciplines.
Did they tell you right to your face?
Oh yes, there was no doubt. You had applications with a form, and you had to put your picture. And then they had many kinds. You had colored, Negro, and foreign. So you could come from Africa and get in to study where you couldn't get in as a Negro or a colored. And they had different classes. If you were foreign black, you weren't a Negro or you weren't a colored. They had all kind of stupid classifications. And so, and then there were time foreign black, Negro, colored. You just couldn't get in, period, because that discipline, they didn't take black people or African people to study in that area.
What was this discipline you were trying to get into at Columbia?
Anthropology.
Anthropology.
Yes.
How did you become interested in that?
Well, for a number of reasons. the African movement for independence was going on, even though there was a war.
In Harlem, it was very active.
In Harlem, in the Caribbean, some people in the Caribbean, and naturally in Europe and so forth. The Nnamdi Azikiwe's from Nigeria, the Kwame Nkrumahs and the Nyomboro, Awolo. These are names that may not be familiar to some of the young fellows who follow African nationalism, but those were the big names at the time.
Well, I wanted to ask you, what was Harlem like when you arrived in those days?
Harlem was something. Harlem was Harlem. Today, Harlem is a shadow of itself. When I came on a Saturday afternoon, or a Saturday, 100 Lenox Avenue from 110th Street up to the river, I would say from 5 o'clock in the afternoon, about 90% of the people on the street, people sitting on the stoop because there were no air condition. And
when you say up to the river, you mean at 155th?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Harlem in that time, if you heard a person snatch a purse, people would speak for that about 2 weeks. People would be speaking about that. It was so rare. Harlem at that time, drug was maybe 1 or 2 musicians, maybe. It wasn't even a musician, it wasn't common. Sunday afternoon in Harlem, from 7th Avenue down, was Easter. Every Sunday was Easter.
You mean everybody had their...
dressed in their best. 8th Avenue, up 8th Avenue, Duke Ellington's Take the A Train was true. But you get up 145th Street, you get to the more influential, the better dressed, the better eaten with the pork and beans, of course, the cans and the thing. You had the man of Walkers, you had the man of Sinclair's, the Renaissance still going on, the Mama Lou's and Jenny and the Frasers for the restaurant. It was a time when still the Packards, the big time cows, the Packard and Lafayette, where people all over the world came to Harlem to eat. You did not eat. I don't care what the war or nothing else. What was the name you call? You didn't eat unless you came to Harlem to eat.
Of all this excitement and stimulating activity in Harlem, what were you doing at the time?
Oh, I was studying. Then I started...
on your own or
yes,
in school?
And in school. I had finished school a short period of time. I had gone to Cuba. Back there, got the master's degree in anthropology and the doctorate in anthropology. And then I'd come back to...
In other words, because you, excuse me, but because you couldn't get into Colombia, you went to Cuba to finish your education.
Right.
And you studied where in Cuba?
Universidad de Havana, the University of Havana.
Mm-hmm. And you stayed there and got your master's degree?
Yeah.
And then you came back to Harlem?
Not directly. I went back to Puerto Rico and then came back to Harlem.
I see.
And then I became very active in the Harlem scene, not in the direct political sense, because I became involved in the African freedom movement, the movement of the Nkrumahs, and the started by Dr. Bain, the Ethiopian World Federation. I became, because then I had these background from my father. I had a series of names that when I go to Ethiopia, I knew my family tree. I knew there were no family tree on my father's side, but 1 or 2 families that they said possibly were family. Those are La Valley, but really we couldn't tie it together. But I knew that if I had reached to Ethiopia, I'd be able to go because my father gave me names and people to go. So when I came here, I joined the movements that were dealing with Garveyism, that element of the UNIA that was still remaining. Some men from Antigua, a fellow named Brian from Barbados, and there were so many here at the time.
You never got to meet Dr. Marcus Garvey?
I met him in England eventually, luckily, when I went on to England. to do the studies. But I met him at Albert Hall. He was giving a lecture there, and then he
Where was Albert Hall?
in England, in London.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the Africa House, there was then, and I think there still is, Africa House, and I met him one day. The day I met Garvey was the day I met heaven, because in the room was Nkrumah, Nandi Zukwe, Jomo Kenyatta, Garvey, Nirumburu, Awawolo. They were having an all-Africa conference of the Africans who were in England at the time. I was a young man. Comparatively, at 68, I was still a young man then. And I was literally sitting at the feet of these giants. And I mean, I was spellbound. I don't think I winked my eyelid once or breathed more than a light murmur, because I was in a council of the gods and had the privilege of seeing all these great men all at once.
What kind of a man was Garvey?
Garvey was...
Was he warm or was he icy like Dr. Du Bois, you say?
No, Garvey was a fight, I would say a hot plate for to cook on.
Serious all the time?
Serious, vibrant, and when he had no periods in his speech. He spoke like a machine. Blah, 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 blah. You know, just like you hear him giving the lecture. That's the way he spoke. He had so much to say in so short a time to say it. And then he had his experience here in jail, people who had deceived him, people who had framed him up and all this kind of thing. People who he expected as his first lieutenant who double-crossed him for little jobs for the federal government and all these kinds of things. And then he was there without a family. And so you see, an integrity that was going to work for the colonial system, all of these kind of things. So I met him at that point. You could say the rage was deep. Mm-hmm. So I saw the fireball of a Garvey. Though dying, you could say, physically, still...
He was ill?
Yeah, he was ill. He was not himself. I didn't know him as a young man, of course, but I could see from the Garvey I heard of and the Garvey I met, we could see this was a dying Garvey. Mm-hmm. But still strong, still proud. And I could say, a part of my pride about being an African could be attributed to Garvey also. Besides my father, I will say Garvey had a tremendous impact on my pride as an African person.
Mm-hmm. All right, so you left Prince Albert Hall, came back to the United States. That was just a visit.
Yeah.
To participate in that conference. What happened to your development back in Harlem?
Well, there were a number of people there. Dr. Hudgens. I didn't know John as much. I've met John a few times, John Clark, in the Schomburg collection, and he was struggling like myself and others in history because nobody wanted to hear us. J.A. Rogers, and I don't know, Dr. Seifert. Harlem was just an emporium of African intellectual thought. And so I got into it. Richard B. Moore was there. You probably remember, he's passed on. These minds, and then the Richard Wrights and the others were also
So did you meet on a regular basis? Did you communicate? Did you exchange books and knowledge?
Yes, Richard Moore had every Sunday at 310 Lenox Avenue. I think it's now where the the Mutual Building were.
That's where WLIB used to be.
That's right there. We would have Sunday afternoon and sometimes Saturday afternoon meetings. You want to hear something, Gil? We used to go down and pay people 25 cents to come up and listen. There were times we paid people to come up to the lectures.
To listen to? To
listen, hoping that it would start. I remember one time Philippa Schuyler was a little girl. She was a child prodigy of the piano. And everything, we used to sponsor her. She'd come and play the piano, and then the lectures would come, Richard and all those people. Eventually I got a chance to do some lecturing too. Yeah, that's where the West Indian Federation got its seed in those meetings. Richard Moore and Barnes and Domingo and Malliot. Malliot was on the Amsterdam News. Domingo, I think, also. These were men who started the struggle for the Federation. Malliot and Domingo for Jamaica, very heavy with Bustamante and Buster's brother.
Manley, Norman Manley?
Norman Manley would come there. Adams from Barbados, and others.
They were always coming in and talking and lecturing.
Right there at the forum.
But Harlem didn't turn out en masse to listen to this.
Not to listen to those. Harlem turned out en masse for Randolph. A. Philip Randolph, the men for the Urban League, Walter White. NAACP Urban League was the big thing. Africa, nobody wanted to hear. Nobody wanted to be black. You see, everybody was colored and Negroes. They didn't know that Negro was a word that the Portuguese invented in the 16th and 17th century for us. They didn't know that colored didn't say, what color should a colored me color? And
so you're saying that the NAACP and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters Union, they were talking about
integration, getting a path to the action, even amalgamation. Walter White had come up with his nonsense about, maybe, he said there's a joke later, maybe we should take an injection, some scientists should make an injection and tell all of us white. He never said tell all of us black, because white is that light, I don't think he want to go black. He didn't think of all of us coming black. Well, that was the trend of the time. To call a person an African was an insult, and most, not all people, of course, but the vast majority. The conch was the big thing, you know, putting the lie in your head and taking a comb and going fast, and then it comes straight and so forth, the zoot suit, and, you know. But there was the other element. There was strong force of the Cypherts, and the Cyphert had an institute and many other speaking. There was a woman, Miss McBroom from Jamaica, who had a school on African history. There were a number of schools. Two or three of us started a school for African thought. And we had the school in Amsterdam Avenue by 125th Street there. So it was that element still stood there.
Was there a split among black people between those who were born in the States and those from the Caribbean?
Yes, if I want to be honest about it, it died out by a very common element. And I'm going to say it in a nice stage because I'm on TV, love making. The Caribbean man and woman and the Caribbean and the African-American man and woman amalgamated as was to be expected, and love solved it all. It's come back.
Not all of it, because
it's a little bunch of fools who will still continue fighting. And when we are Africans, I solved that in my sense by explaining to my children and others, the boats, the slave boats, when the slave trade started, and the Pope Martin V of the Roman Catholic Church and Bishop Las Casas started the slave trade to the West. The boats didn't come from Africa to America. They came from Africa to the Caribbean, mainly Jamaica and Cuba. These were the Spanish thing. The first set of slaves came to Cuba and Jamaica, and then to Barbados and the other islands, as the others came into effect with it, the British and others. They were in the Caribbean from 1506. The first group of indentured workers didn't come to America until 1619 or 20 at Jamestown, Virginia. So I always tell people, what nonsense you talking about? We are all African. They didn't bring West Indians, and not one West Indian I ever met, because Columbus, that fool, lost his way, and he thought he had found India. They brought people from the Caribbeans, African Caribbeans, and the first of them came from Barbados to Virginia, going on holiday to Boston, to England. Now, so far, it's 100 and odd years African people were in the Caribbeans before they came here. It doesn't mean the first Africans came to North America then, because Estevanico with Cortes, little Estevan, came here and went to what is today New Mexico and so forth before the first European came here as a colonist. So I wasn't talking about, but I'm talking about groups during and after the slave period of time. So all of us, as so-called Geechee is a good best example of it. The Geechee is the remaining merger of the two cultural African group in terms of linguistics, those from the Caribbean and those from here. Those who had developed here a southern kind of English from the ignorant European in the south, and those who had come from the Caribbean with a development of English, and the same thing. The colonialist European was an illiterate European. I would say the slop of Europe came to America, not the intellectual of Europe didn't come here. So that the African was brought into European culture, not by an intelligent European teacher, but a broken down debaucher of European culture. So that's why the African didn't get much of European culture. Otherwise, you would have seen from then that European culture is rooted strictly in African culture. The Greeks, the Ethiopian and Nubian taught, the Egyptians, Ethiopian Nubians taught and brought the Greeks into civilization.
When did you decide that you were going to focus on Egypt and become what you're now known as an Egyptologist? Is that relatively recent, or does that go back?
No, I wrote my first book, We the Black Jews, in my last year of college in 1938, a pamphlet, and that was showing the origin of Judaism in Egypt.
What prompted you to do that?
Because
of your religion?
Partly, but mostly because people in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands look at a black Jew and laugh. And I was trying to show them that Judaism didn't start in Europe. There was no European history when Judaism started. There were no Greeks, no Romans, no Etruscans. Abraham was in Africa, a place called Egypt. Egypt is always in Africa. Moses is born in Africa. And the pages of where Moses says the Ten Commandments, Moses didn't get any Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai. And then my father pointed out to me, Moses, as I said, was a priest in Egypt. And Daddy showed me, if he was a priest in Egypt, it took 40 years to train a priest. He went into the priesthood at age 7, and he came out at 47. And in the place where he went, the mystery system, they had already been teaching the negative confession, 42 commandments, such as, I have not killed my father or my mother. I have not made like my bushel. I have not spoken ill of the gods, and so. They call it negative confession. You could see them in the tomb of Ramesses VI and other places.
And that's the basis of the Ten Commandments?
Right. And one and only God, Akhenaten, otherwise known as Amenhotep IV, had already taught of a one and only God by the name of Aten. And Amenhotep died before Moses was born, and he was teaching about monotheism, and so on and so on and so on. The Jews talk about the God, the golden cow, the golden calf. And when you go to Africa, or to Egypt and Ethiopia, you see the picture of the golden calf as Goddess Het Heru, the West scholar Hathor, a cow with a disc between her arms, that was the golden calf that the Jews worshiped, an African woman.
So you got into Egyptology really to answer those who were saying that Egypt was
a European country, and it was this country, because then I found out that Egypt, like all the other places in Africa, North Africa in particular, was as African as Congo is today, or Munomatapa, which they call South Africa now. I find that the first non-African people to come into Egypt were the Hyksos in 1675. And subsequent to the Hyksos, the Assyrians, and the Hyksos in 1655, which were the 13th dynasty. By the way, that was the time when Abraham was born. That was the time when the Jews came, the Hebrews came into Egypt, because Jews is a misnomer. It's only one of the tribe. It's the Hebrew people, the Hebrew tribes and Judah. The tribe, the warrior tribe, the tribe of the army was only one of the many tribes. All right. And then after that came the Assyrian, the Ethiopian was ruling Egypt and the Nile at the time. Then came the Persians from Persia with Cambyses in 525, and subsequently the Greeks in 332, by then with Alexander, the son of Philip of Macedonia. And then in 47 came the Romans with Julius the Caesar, and so on and so on. Those amalgamating armies produced the half caste that you see predominantly, and then finally, of course, the Arabs and others.
All right. Where did you get all this information from, and how do you study?
Well, I then went to Egypt, and I went to do first an examination for myself. I hooked up with a team there that was teaching, but of course, when they make the fire, Egypt used to have the cobras was still common, and the alligator, not the alligator, crocodile was still common. It came back the other day. They found that there's some crocodiles since dam. Well, the group, I was the only black person, and when they start the fire, they didn't let me come next to them. I was kept 50 feet at least from them, so sometime I was...
fire? What do you mean?
You had to fire to, when you're doing the field work in the field, you had a fire to keep the snakes and things away from you in the night. But I didn't get to the fire. I was black. My skin might have rubbed off on somebody. So I kept up, but I didn't care in the sense, don't mean that I like snakes, but I took the chance. Well, I started there and went into the tombs and temples. It is then I found out for sure that African people, black people, were getting a bill of goods, that they were lying to us in the Bible, they were lying to us in the textbooks, they were lying to us everywhere. And I started to realize that men like Forstolnik James, Professor George James, and others were correct. I saw the statue of Ramesses II at Abu Simbel. That time they didn't move it up for the dam. I went and said to Tonkanen statue. I went to Abydos and saw right in there, saw the story of the negative confession. Of virgin birth, Isis getting pregnant by immaculate conception, giving birth of a child. I went to the island of Philae and saw the beginning of the story of a man who killed his brother, Set Typhon, who killed his brother Osiris, and the revenge murder by Horus, the nephew of Set Typhon, at the temple at Edfu, long before the story of Cain and Abel. When I saw these things, and I saw the pyramids, and note that the pyramid didn't have a brick made of any material, much less mud brick made of straw. And then I noted, the records show that the pyramid, the last of the major pyramids at Giza, was in the 4th dynasty. And the first Jew, Abraham, wasn't born until the 13th dynasty. And then I started to question myself and my religious position. And I asked, how could this be that? And then I said, I look in the Torah and noticed that nothing is said in the Torah about building the pyramid. That's folklore. It's not, nobody, for some reason, that rumor went on and on and on, that the Hebrew built the pyramid. Of the 72 pyramids, they're all before Hebrewism. And so I started to question.
All the pyramids were built
before the birth of Abraham. And especially the ones that everybody go to, those at Giza. Those pyramids, the big one you see at Giza is by Khufu, which the Greeks call Cheops. Later, of course. Khafra, which is Khufu's son, which the Greeks call, they call it Chephren. And the other ones, I suppose, just have to slip me, Menkaura, whom the Greeks call Mycerinus. Those 3 pyramids are in the 4th dynasty, 2000 and at BC. Abraham's birth is until 1600 and at BC. You know, we talk about the time is going the reverse way. The one at Saqqara by the architect and multi-genius Imhotep is 2785 BC. 1,008 years before the birth of Abraham.
So when you saw all this information, you decided to do what with it?
I decided that somehow I got to get it to the African community in the Western Hemisphere. At that early stage in my, I got to get it to become more popular, to be in the African church. And then by that time, there were African synagogues, Rabbi Matthews and a number of others. I had to get this information into Rabbi Matthews, and it was never respected. Rabbi Block and a few other white rabbis given some recognition, but by and large, it was never recognized.
So you came back and you began to lecture?
I came and began to lecture free. Never charged for my lectures.
Where would you lecture?
Well, sometimes I get a chance in the Y, the theater in the Y, or Brother Moore in his Harlem Forum, in some schools, in some private organizations that will invite me. A few black teachers, African American teachers who had integrity of their pride in their blackness and in their Africanness, they would invite me and so on.
When did you decide to publish?
I decided to publish because I found that the written word goes much farther than the spoken words, at least in those days. There wasn't the tape recorders and so forth. It was your voice and that's it. And when you spoke, only a handful hear you. But if you wrote, the book travels, one book may go in the hand of 50 different people, whereas and umpteen books, you know, you multiply by those 50. And so I decided that I had to publish. I didn't have the means to publish. I didn't have the expertise of the editors and so forth.
Wait, couldn't you find a publisher?
No, you couldn't find a white publisher who wanted to publish something in Africa from an African point of view.
You approached them?
I approached almost everyone, McKay, McGraw-Hill, and Schuster, and you name it. I approached them, I went, and I had such excuse as too much documentation.
Too much documentation.
Too much. I had one time some pages with nothing but documentation. It was too much. One person tell me, why you want to, all the way back there, the term reverse racism, why you want, for instance, I show pictures of Jesus being black, of black popes, the 3 black popes of the Catholic Church. I show the African emperors of Rome, Honorius, Septimus Severus, and Caracalla. All those things, the publishers didn't want out, and then they sent me sometime to the advisors, the consultant. And of course, these are the same consultant work I got refute. And
Honorius had black skin?
Oh no, black as a tar baby. Yes, and Augustine, St. Augustine was from Numidia. You see pictures of Augustine and things in some of these places. They're big lies, frauds. Augustine, who had the picture of Augustine? Augustine tell you who he was in the confession. And it's just...
What did he say in the confessions?
He
described himself?
Yes, and spoke of him being a Mantian of Numidia. And you know who the Mantians were? They were like Ace of Spades, and described them as the darkest thing on earth.
So when you couldn't get a publisher, what'd you do?
I went literally, and they had pawn shops in Harlem then. The drugs wasn't so big, and you could sell this thing in the. I went to a pawn shop, literally, pawned some of my clothes to add to the little money I had, and I published the first book in the United States. Was Black Man of the Nile, a little paper, not the third. This is the third edition now, but the first edition was 200 or 300 pages, a little cheap paper. I did it on a mechanical Olympus typewriter, and I bang out the pages and get it the best I could. I write it, edit it, did the correction, did everything, did the artwork, like I still do in all of my books, and got a copy. I didn't know where to carry it after it was printed. Where I going to store it? I store some of them by my bed, some of the kitchen table, and so forth. And one day, Mr. Michaud had his bookstore. And I went to him and I said, would you sell this book for me? He says, who are you? And I said, probably not much, but I am an author. And he says, and I describe, I was teaching then at that time, part-time at Teachers College, a course under Dr. Ralph Linton. The course was handled by Dr. Tewksbury and Dr. Coombe and myself. It was called Education 500. So I explained to him, he says, that's not enough. I said, well, I speak on the corner with the brothers sometime. I lecture at night, history and so on. He said, you're the fellow. I said, yeah. He said, let me see the book. So I gave him, he says, oh, that's good about African people. Oh, man, look at this, these dates and all the pharaohs listed. And he said, man, he said, this must be good. So he said, give me 3. So I gave him the 3 books. Before I got through the door, some people in there said, let me see the book. And one man said, how much is it? And I said, $2. He said, $2 for this? So I thought that the man was complaining about the price. I said, well, I could make, he says, no, I'm not complaining, it should be $5. So the man gave me $5. And then Michelle put the price to $5. So the other 2 bought it. So Michelle said, bring a box. So I went up to the house and brought a box. And by the time I was out, the half box went, Miss Brown was there selling at the time. So Michelle said, wait, bring 2 boxes more. And it's so that the book started, and I started mailing out the books, and the word of mouth. I couldn't advertise. I didn't have a distributor. I still don't have a distributor.
And by word of mouth, the book became very popular.
To the United States until the 3rd edition. Another thing now goes to Japan, and even Liechtenstein buy books from me, and universities almost everywhere, all Alaska, go to the Caribbean, and the motherland, of course, Africa.
How many books have you published?
To date, about, I think the last count was 29. I think 29, and some pamphlets will be 32.
Mm-hmm. And the prime focus is Africa.
The main focus, yes, the sole focus is Africa and African people.
More specifically, North Africa?
Yes.
Egypt.
North Africa and down, especially down the Nile, the valley of the Nile. And that concentration is due to that the area where man's civilization started. Even there was no Samaria yet. There was no Babylonia or anything like that. The Chinese had not produced a single book yet. And those people, the ancient Egyptians themselves, the ancient Africans, stated in the Papyrus of Nefer, and I quote, we came from the beginning of the Nile, where God, happy, H-A-P-I, dwells, at the foothill of the mountain of the moon, unquote. The beginning of the Nile is 2 places. You got Uganda, the Blue Nile, Ethiopia, Uganda, the White Nile, Ethiopia, the Blue Nile. The mountain of the moon, you have 2 in Africa. One is called Kilimanjaro, between Kenya and Tanganyika, and the other one is called Rwenzori. And the Twa and the Hutu, the small people, which people call pygmy, ugly term, those people you can find even in South Africa today as the Kalahari and the Kalahari and the Khoikhoi. The European Wilfrid de Stott, the name I call them Hottentots and some other name has been. But you can find those people in Egyptian history also as the Sibenetos and the Sinabs. They were the only people that brought down even the symbol today, the Ankh, which Christians are now using in America, and by the time Tatankan exhibit come here and don't know they are using what they once called a pagan object.
And so you decided that even though you weren't able to get a publisher, You're going to publish this out of your own pocket.
I did.
Have you made much money off of your books?
I have lost money consistently and still do.
Why do you do it then?
Well, Gil, suppose I had a yacht in the basin by 72nd Street, a condominium for $140,000 and a Mercedes-Benz or Lamborghini, not calling them down. Does that make me a man? Won't I still be called by the least educated European a nigger? Won't I be still called inferior, uneducated, welfare client? Won't I, with all that money?
What then makes you a man?
My integrity, the knowledge of myself. You see, what they call me matters not. I go in the poorest of restaurant in Harlem and sit there in the morning, and I am a proud man, no less proud than sitting here, the Wall of Astoria, in Regan living room. I am a man. And I'm a man because I know I am a man. I saw the evidence that I'm a man because I know where man's origin of civilization came from. Because I have seen it, dealt with the documents, taken the pictures, got the slides, all this. And I am a man like any other man. And that's why I can decide that no other man I respect any more than myself.
But you've also lately gotten involved with taking guided tours, conducting guided tours to Africa, the Nile.
Yes.
How did that develop?
I had taken individuals over the last umpteen years. And about 1978, Dr. Richard King of California, a psychiatrist, Dr. King said to me, Dr. Ben, you've taken one or two people to Egypt to study and so forth. Why don't you take groups? I said, man, I don't have the time, and you have to need a travel agency and all that. He said, no, well, let's just see what we could do. And he went and organized a group in Watts, the Fanon group, from the Fanon Center. And he said, would you lead us to the Nile? I said, sure. And so in 1976 or 78, the Fanon Center made a tour, educational tour to Somalia, Kenya, and Egypt. Some went there. And I led that group down the Nile because I believe begin my trip at the southern part of Egypt down to the center because the Nile flow south to north, not north to south. And the civilization came down the Nile. And then so I started, but I let them know I will not take anybody to any part of Africa, and especially the Nile, for a vacation, for tourism. You have to sign up and agree that it's going to be an educational tour. Now, in the afternoon, when you finish, you could go and do what you want. You could buy the whole of Egypt. You could play around. But you're going to sign up to take that tour. And you got to go out in the field and take that tour unless you're sick.
And you lecture on the site.
I lecture on the site, and I lecture 1 hour in the hotel in the room. And there's a question and answer period about the history of what you have seen. Gil, if you came, it would transform your life. It can't help it. You see, I say, it's going to transform your life either negatively, positively, but you will not be the same. You can't come there and see all these things, invalidating some of the myths you were taught, validating the integrity of yourself. And since I carry African people like any other group, there are some people, it is my people need education. And when you go there and see Ramesses II, and see the Sphinx of Giza, which is the statue of God Hamakas, and also the statue of Pharaoh Khafra, you see what your people have done down through the years, and find the lies you were told in schools, synagogues, mosques, and all these different things. See the story of the Immaculate Conception 4,000 years before Mary and Jesus, and see all these things in front of your face. It transforms your life.
One of his notable works is The Might of the Jewish Race, in which he discusses the origin of the Jewish people. In this book, Dr. Ben-Jochannan challenges the traditional narrative of Jewish origins and argues that the historical evidence points to African origin for the Jewish people. He suggests that the ancient Hebrews were a black African people and that their history has been misrepresented and distorted over time. Dr. Ben-Jochannan's scholarship often provokes controversy and sparks important discussions about race, identity, and historical accuracy. While not all scholars agree with his interpretations, his work has undoubtedly contributed to broader conversations about the diversity and complexity of human history. Dr. Yosef Ben-Johannan's views on the origin of the Jews diverge from mainstream narratives. He argued that the historical evidence pointed to African origin for the Jewish people, specifically suggesting that the ancient Hebrews were of black African descent. Dr. Ben-Jochannan challenged the traditional Eurocentric perspective on Jewish history, which often portrays the Jewish people as originating solely from Middle East. Instead, he proposed that the origins of the Jewish people could be traced back to ancient African civilizations. He argued that the Hebrews were among the many African peoples who made significant contributions to human civilization. His views were part of a broader effort to highlight the contribution of African civilization to world history and to challenge the marginalization and erasure of African people from historical narratives. While his interpretations have been controversial and not universally accepted among scholars, they have stimulated important discussions about the diversity and complexity of human history. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and share your thoughts in the comment box below. Until next time, cheers and have a good one.